Guys, so today is a special day. I'm going to show you how to faux serge seams on your sewing machine. I'm Shiardia Garaby and welcome to the Stitchery. So today I'm going to show you how to faux serge seams, at least my way. For the ease of my stutter, I'm going to now stop trying to say faux serge. So on my sewing machine, usually I have 3 ways that I can serge and that work well. So I'm going to show you these 3 ways and I will fix up some towels while I'm at it. Yay! Alright, so to get started, I want to just walk you through the 3 steps that are really important. 1, you are going to have to pick your thread. So if you have regular polyester, coats, Gutermann, those kind of thing, better thread, I would say that you only have to do one of these kinds of seams once. Now, if you are using a cheaper thread, like some hand sewing threads, some coats and duties, because they do break down a little more than others, and serger thread, which is what I tend to use, then you're going to have to do each of these seams at least twice. So if you do a straight stitch, you are definitely going to have a zigzag stitch next to it. If you do a zigzag stitch alone, then you're going to have to do a secondary zigzag stitch with it. If you use the decorative stitches, they're already making 2 seams, so you can use them once. I only use them twice because I want to make sure they're super sturdy. Alright, so those are the important parts there. The second one is that your needle. Make sure that the needle you are using is the needle that you need for the fabric you are sewing onto. So if you're using knit, make sure that it's a ballpoint. If you're using regular toweling or if you're using cotton, then you can use the universals and things like that. Make sure you double check your needle. The third really important step that you're going to have to check constantly is your tensions. For the most part, on most fabrics, you'll find a setting that works, and then that'll be your main setting. However, with these serge stitches, it sometimes gets a little weird because you're picking up the threads on the sides of fabric, and that means that occasionally you're picking up these little bits, and that causes your tension to kind of lose a stitch on some machines, especially these little, what are they called? Home sewing machines, I believe, like for personal use instead of industrial machines. They have a lot of tension issues when it comes to these thready parts, so you might have to tighten or lower the tension as you go. Make sure you raise your needle all the way up before you change the tension, and preferably cut your string. So cut all your threads off and then start your seam again before you tension again. Simply because this will allow your machine to reset and to skip out on having skipped stitches. So just a little bit of wiggle room, do the first couple of inches of your material and try to figure out where you're going to need that extra tension issue. All right, let's get started. Alright, so here we are at my sewing machine. I don't have any thread in it yet. I'm going to thread it with this gray so that we can see it. I've got a yellow bobbin underneath, so we'll really be able to see everything nicely. I'm going to use 2 different color threads so that you can actually see the 2 kinds of stitches that you're getting on the front and back. First stitch is a straight stitch. That is what's going to lock the seam the first time. So as if you had just sewed a seam onto your fabric, or you have just started your project and you want to make sure that you know where you're sewing to. I would say most of these straight stitches you should put next to your sewing line. But because I'm just going around the edges of my material, I'm going to put them in about 1/4 of an inch in, which is just the width of my sewing foot here, and my straight stitch foot. And as you can tell, that is not the straightest stitch in the world, but because this is just to clean up the edges of my toweling here, I'm not purposely trying to be straight. I'm just trying to get the edge. And now I am going to change foot back to my hemming foot. Now, if you are zigzagging, make sure that you are not using any of these kind of feet, the ones with the tiny hole, because you will end up clipping the edge of that hole and throwing needles at your face, etc. So instead of doing that, what we're going to do is we're going to switch over to what I call my hemming foot, which I think my book calls an embroidery foot. I don't know. This is the one that I use the most. It has a super wide spot for zigzags, and as you can tell, it's probably been caught a couple of times. That's because if a needle bends and you don't notice before it hits the plate, it leaves little divots because this is just soft aluminum. Not good for your machine. So try to do it as little as possible. So now we're going to switch over to zigzag. For me, that is 3 on my machine. And I'm going to widen my width a little bit because I would like to be able to go to the edge of the fabric. Then I'm going to line this up and as you can see, it's kind of a wide zigzag, so I'm actually going to narrow that down slightly. The reason you want a narrower zigzag versus a wider zigzag is you want to catch more of these threads that are on the edge here so that they don't pull. So I'm going to go 2.5. That's probably good. Yeah, that's fairly okay. Now, because this is toweling and not something that is super thready, this will hold fairly well and will, once I trim off this extra edge here, it'll be perfect. Now, these are all trim methods except for the very last. So stick with me and I'll show you the rest. Alright guys, so now we're going to switch over from that particular hem to the second version, which is actually using a stitch on my machine, which my machine it calls a blind hem stitch, so that on mine. So since I had some trouble getting my machine into focus, the number 4 stitch and number 5 stitch are right here, and this is what they look like on my machine. And then my 17 and my 18 are right here, and this is what they look like. So as I explain, this is for your guide. Is this stitch right here. It is a couple of straight stitches with a zigzag. These are the more useful ones as I am putting my fabric this way, so towards this side of the machine, and I'm lining it up with this side of the foot. Then I'm going to want to use number 5, which my machine calls a shell tuck stitch. So we're going to go with number 5 here on this edge. If we were sewing the other way and our fabric was close to this edge and we had most of the bulk of it on this side, then we would use number 4. Now, again, I am using serger thread, so I have to do these seams at least twice. So I'm going to go over it with the number 5, and then I will come back and do the number 4 back across it. If you are using better thread, then you only have to do this one time. You don't have to do the double seam. This is a finishing seam that's going to probably either be tacked down or sewn to the insides of fabrics. So very often you will only need one seam. However, because I'm using a weaker thread, I like to make sure that my thread won't break if it goes through the washing machine or the dryer, which these will. So just using the 5, so as you can see, most of this fabric is being caught every half an inch or so. And on some fabrics that don't fray a lot, this will be perfect. This one seam will be plenty. However, if you're going to leave this edge raw, or if you're going to, like me, leave this edge to the outside of the fabric and this is going to get rubbed and washed a lot and this fabric frays very easily, it's going to need the second seam. You can either go and do a zigzag stitch beside this straight stitch, or you can do the specialty seam that I'm going to do. Now, the reason you serge is to catch these threads so they don't fray. So you want to sew as close to this edge as you can. You can, like I do, sew a bit further in, as that means I'm just going to have to trim off the edge close to the seam. And that's fine. Trimming is normal. And it will clean up all of these edges that you're going to end up having that have already frayed. You'll be able to trim those off at the end. And now there you go. And that edge is now done, and it just needs to be trimmed a little. Alright, and now for the third one. On my machine, this is 17 and 18, which are my elastic overlock stitches, and they are a specialty stitch, so I have to turn my stitch width over here to specialty, and then I have to follow my guide, which generally says between 3 and 5 for the stitch width, and then the tension varies depending on what you're sewing. I love this stitch. This is my favorite way to serge. This is my favorite way to finish up stuff. This is wonderful. This seam has made it much easier on me because I don't have to do any of this twice. I can just do either 18 or 17 depending on which way my fabric is going, and it's good to go. It is basically the equivalent of doing 2 seams at once with a nice back stitch for locking. It is wonderful. So far, this is the only stitch that has its own back stitch, so you have to be really careful not to pull on the fabric or try to guide it yourself, because the fabric is going to be fed back and forth through the machine as the stitch goes. So this is a tricky one to get used to, but once you get used to it, it is the best. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go across with 18, because my fabric is, again, going through the machine with the edge being close to this side of the foot. If I was going through the machine and my edge was on this side of the foot, then I would use 17. You want your points, your zigzags, to go towards the edge of your fabric. That's what's going to catch these edges. This is what's going to catch the frays, and that's going to lock that in so that it doesn't unravel. And that's what we're going to do. So there you go. And this is a no trim way in order to do your edging, because those zigzags you can get almost to the very edge and you will have no problems. If you are doing a seam, make sure this is not your seam. So this is not your straight stitch that you're going to sew to your other fabric. This is just the edging to keep your fraying. So that's what it looks like with just one, and I will show you what it looks like with both. Now there you go. A nice interlocked serged seam that is super sturdy and will make sure that this edge does not move, wiggle, or fray beyond what it really already is. A couple of these might come off once or twice, and I can quickly just trim those ones off since my thread didn't quite catch them, but that's it. And you are done and ready to go. Your seams are all serged, and you are ready to sew. Have fun, guys!